So Jonathan is an expert in irregular warfare, counterterrorism, foreign security forces, development and assessment, strategic operational design, and monitoring and evaluation, and as a research director at the Center for Naval Analysis. His previous roles include as senior advisor positions with International Security Assistance Forces in Afghanistan, U.S. Central Command, multinational forces in Iraq, and the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Forces and U.S. Marine Forces Special Operations Command. His notable projects include several independent assessments of Afghanistan security forces, a congressionally mandated Special Operations Force structure assessment, and an independent review of the Marine Corps failure force design. Dr. Schrodin's achievements include CNA's Deploy Award for Analytic Excellence and Cornell University's Tunis Wintig Award, and as well as inclusion into University of Minnesota's Duluth Academy of Sciences and Engineering, and a very good friend of mine. Jonathan, I'm going to hand this over to you, please.
I'd like to open by thanking Dr. Farhadi, General McKenzie, University of South Florida, and the members of the Afghanistan War Commission who made this event happen today. I think I can say hands down that this has been one of the most frank dialogues on Afghanistan that I've attended in recent years. And I will attribute that to the fact that we got all of these esteemed folks out of DC, where they oftentimes feel like they have to tread a bit lightly, down to Tampa, where we can talk straight. And so welcome to Tampa, where you get it straight. So welcome to the panelists as well. It's great to have you here. The title of this panel is Lessons Learned or Not Learned. And really the goal of the panel, as I expressed it to the panelists, is twofold. One is to identify key themes of the war that is in our past. And the second is to inform the policy that is yet to come. And with the result of the recent election now known, I think it's a perfect time for a bit of introspection to inform the incoming administration. And it's probably especially prescient that we're here in Tampa, since it looks like the incoming administration will be led primarily by Floridians. To help us do that, we've obviously, USF, the organizers, have assembled an incredible panel of esteemed experts that I have the delightful honor of hosting. Their full bios are posted on the website. I'm not going to belabor the point of reading them all to you, but I encourage you to look those up on the website. I'm just going to briefly introduce each of the speakers here, hitting a couple of high points. So Dr. Andrew Wilder has served as the Vice President of the U.S. Institute for Peace's Asia Center since 2015. He joined USIP in August of 2010 and previously served as the Director of Afghanistan and Pakistan Programs and Vice President of South and Central Asia programs there. In 2021, Dr. Wilder was appointed to serve as a member of the Afghanistan War Commission, one of the commissioners. Dr. Marvin Weinbaum, down on the end, is currently Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies at the Middle East Institute and Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he previously served as the Director of the Program of South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. He also previously served as the Senior Analyst for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, INR. We also have Ambassador Retired Omar Samad with us, who is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center and CEO of Silk Road Consulting. He's a member of the Afghan Future Thought Forum, which is an intra-Afghan dialogue platform, and he's also a member of USIP's Track 2 Afghan Dialogue series. He's a founding member of the newly established Salam Center for Dialogue, which is a facilitation platform with members inside and outside Afghanistan, and he previously served as Afghanistan's ambassador to both Canada and France. We also have with us Dr. Habiba Sarabi, who is a member of the steering committee of the Women's Forum on Afghanistan. She's a pharmacist and influential Afghan politician, having previously served as the governor of Bamiyan province, the first woman to ever serve as the governor of a province in Afghanistan, as well as the Minister of Women's Affairs. She was also the deputy of Afghanistan's High Peace Council and a member of the Islamic Republic's peace negotiation team. And last but certainly not least, we have with us Dr. Barnett Rubin, who is a distinguished fellow at New York University's Center on International Cooperation, where he previously directed the Afghanistan-Pakistan Regional Program. Dr. Rubin has also worked with the Council on Foreign Relations, Columbia University, USIP, and Yale University, among many others, and he served as a special advisor to the U.S. government at several key junctures of the U.S. war in Afghanistan. So as you can tell, you're in for a real treat, as I said, with this particular panel. We have two key questions that the organizers have posed for the panelists, and so I thought what I'd do is pose the first and solicit your views, and then we'll go back and I'll pose the second, and we'll get you one more time, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And I assume you've all seen the QR code that you can scan in order to enter your questions. Please do that. I'll turn to the iPad in just a moment to start seeing those come in. But the first question, and I'm going to start down on the end with you, Marvin, if that's all right, is what key policy lessons were learned, or perhaps should we have learned, during the 20-year war in Afghanistan? Marvin?
Thank you. I'm going to start off by saying I want to thank Javed in his last remarks, his final remarks, where he suggested that maybe it's time to think outside the box. And I think that sets the tone of what I'm going to be saying. There's been no shortage of efforts to draw lessons from 2 decades of what was an ultimately failed mission in Afghanistan. Most of the takeaways to date have brought to light our faulty assumptions about the Taliban as an adversary and the Afghan government as a partner, our unrealistic efforts at state building, and our military's confusing mandate. But nearly all of what has been discussed as lessons have little or no application in guiding us on how to deal with the Taliban as exercising power, the powers of government. That said, we do have, however, some experiences in dealing with the Taliban over time that can gain us important understanding in how we might craft our policies toward the Taliban. Very briefly, let me suggest some. First of all, I think we're better informed as to who the Taliban are. After several years of trying to negotiate, the U.S. and others come to learn that, albeit slowly, that now and perhaps well before now, they are foremost an disciplined ideological movement set on core beliefs that makes them, for the most part, incapable of compromise. International sanctions and efforts to ostracize the Taliban, as we all very well know, have failed to achieve the policy changes on any real issues of substance. Secondly, if we're ever to see the Taliban modify their policies, it will come from within rather than from without. Changes in the Taliban leadership composition probably offer the best hope for policy reform. Overt attempts to divide the leadership will fail, but it may be possible to strengthen over time those elements most receptive to dialogue and pragmatic choice. This may be encouraged with soft power of assistance that goes beyond humanitarian aid to include the kind of development assistance that creates employment opportunities for needy Afghans, men and women, and also strengthens civil society. Thirdly, we should be prepared for the long game with the Taliban. The Taliban regime seems likely to be in power for the foreseeable future, and we may not see any appreciable improvement in its behavior for some time. The Taliban have repeatedly impressed us with their resilience and tenacity. If we are to make progress in changing their policies, we must be satisfied with incremental gains. There do exist some areas of mutual and overlapping interests that can be pursued, and the U.S. and those of our allies. And these, I believe, are best served by establishing regular opportunities for engagement with the Taliban. Forswearing diplomatic contacts has proved self-defeating. Above all, we also need to keep in mind that after decades of conflict in Afghanistan, the Afghan people believe that the only thing worse than a repressive Taliban regime is a state of political instability that engenders widespread disorder, leading to chaos and civil war. As much as we would like to believe that the Taliban will collapse under the weight of their draconian policies and incompetence in government, this is improbable without a popular, unifying alternative, which is nowhere in sight. Drawing from these observations, let me take in the couple of remaining minutes I have of time to be more explicitly prescriptive. It may be time to align our U.S. diplomatic practices with the on-the-ground realities in Afghanistan. The international community has been united, as we all know, for some time, and rather remarkably, in denying the Taliban formal political recognition. Yet, as has already been pointed out, over time, despite having failed in any of our major objectives through non-recognition, most countries as stakeholders in Afghanistan, one way or another, have increasingly taken steps to institute what constitutes de facto acceptance of the Afghan government. Last week, I thought this would be the last country to do so. India, which was only second in supporting development for the previous Afghan government, invited the Taliban to set up a consulate in New Delhi. The U.S., by contrast, has engaged the Taliban only narrowly and ad hoc. Not a single American diplomat has set foot in Afghanistan since August 2021. As a result, we have ceded to other powers, such as Russia and China, what strategic opportunities there are to influence the Taliban. I'm talking here about creating access, of course. Even if the Taliban policy change seems unlikely for some time, if there's any hope of holding the Taliban regime accountable and reversing its abhorrent policies, it lies in learning more about the Taliban leadership, while at the same time, forming contacts, regular contacts that can be built, that can create relationships and build trust. Of course, my point here is that, in concluding, that we must give consideration to establishing, if not formal diplomatic relations as such, then something short of it that allows for a regular American presence in Kabul, again, access. Any move that suggests granting the Taliban status as Afghanistan's legitimate government is going to be politically difficult in this country. We know that. It's bound to draw accusations of selling out. But increasing a form of recognition, it does not constitute approval of that regime. It does not require that we somehow end our criticism of that regime. There's no point in standing on principle if it's self-defeating and working to the detriment, I believe, of American interests and ultimately also those of the Afghan people. Thank you.
Thank you, Marvin. I appreciate you kicking us off so well. Let me turn it over to Dr. Sarabi next, please.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Very good afternoon to everyone. I want to stress on something that if we had the achievement within 20 years, it was our joint achievement, as I said in the documentary. And the failure is also, I want to say that it's our joint failure. So the lessons that I have learned as a practitioner and working with the local government and also being with the High Peace Council and also a member of negotiation team. The lessons that we have learned from the beginning, 2001, from Bonn Conference. The Bonn Conference was excluded Taliban. So, however, it's very clear in the United Nations, all the declaration that inclusion should be a must. So, but Taliban was a part of the conflict and a part of the problem. U.S. with the engineering of Ambassador Khalilzad, I wish that he was here and listened to that, but I shared with him several times, and we had very, very tough argument in Doha. He was engineering with Lakhdar Ibrahimi. Why they didn't bring Taliban at the table to negotiate with the different part of Afghan delegation? So it was the biggest lessons that we have to learn. After that, when the Taliban, when they, of course, started to the new government, the transition government, the U.S. was proud of its victory and didn't care about the Taliban. Taliban proposed that they want to stay at in their mosque and pray and do not touch to the politics and just leave them alone. And I'm sure that Ambassador Khalilzad and also Minister Jalali will be in the picture that Taliban wanted to, proposed or even send a letter to, according to my information, send a letter to President Karzai, but it was not acceptable for both sides, American and also the government of Afghanistan with some other warlord that the Taliban should leave alone and not take revenge. Unfortunately, after the Bonn Agreement, in a state to healing and reconciliation, especially on the National Directorate of National Security Directorate, they started to take revenge from Taliban. It was, I think, the biggest mistake that to take revenge from Taliban. Also, all the Taliban everywhere were following with the security, intelligence service and security forces. Even they didn't want to have to make a problem for the government of Afghanistan. But so some of them, they were they were not accused for some terrorist attack or some military action. I know that it was in Bamiyan, there were some land dispute between the family, but one of the family member reported to American that my cousin is a terrorist and he is affiliated with Taliban. And he was in a jail, I forgot the name of Guantanamo, yes. He was in Guantanamo. And we were facilitating to release that man that he was accused for terrorist attack and affiliation with Taliban, but he was a normal person. This kind of action happened in several other places and several other provinces. So today, the Taliban started again the same action. They are following the former military group, especially women that they were in the police sector. So they are following them, arresting them, and torturing them, especially women, and that the big member of the police women were from Hazara community, that they are getting tortured by Taliban. So this is, again, the same circle is going on. So the next lessons that I have learned, that of course the Iraq war happened, and there was a impression that American can fight in several fronts or several countries, but it is the issue of focusing. The focus from Afghanistan just shifted to Iraq. It was another problem that why Taliban issue didn't come on a priority. Coming back to this warlordism in Afghanistan, unfortunately, this process of warlordism in Afghanistan is getting harsh and harsh, and U.S. Somehow they had direct contact with some of these warlord and jihadi leaders. Even the National Security Department also, they were not appointed by according to professionalism, but they were appointed by the affiliation with this jihadi group or jihadi leaders. That's why they started to take revenge from Taliban. So this part also was a big problem, and also it was affiliated with corruption. The corruption issue it was a big problem, not only among the Afghan government or Afghan people or Afghan, not only the government, but unfortunately the parliament was also very corrupt people. But somehow, when we are talking about corruption, both sides, when I am talking that the failure is from both sides were involved with corruption. So 70% of the money were going to without the governmental system. Only 30% of the money were coming to Afghanistan with the government system. I can give you an example. 2003, I was the Minister of Women Affairs, and I came here with President Karzai. It was in Georgetown University, and advisor of the Bush administration, she raised a plaque of $5 million, and she said this $5 million is for the Afghan women. So when we went back to home, and after some months, President Karzai asked me that, okay, sister, because he always called me sister. Okay, Sister Sarabi, where is that $5 million? I said, Raisa, President, I don't know, where is that $5 million? Not President Karzai, nor me. We didn't know that where went that $5 million, because the majority of money, as I said, 70% of them, they were going out of this, the system and governmental system with the NGOs, with direct contract, with the contractor. Even at the local level, we didn't have a very high control, or at least we couldn't monitor the system and the contract that have done by the US and PRTs and so many other, international aid that they were coming to Afghanistan. So that's why the society and the community were very disappointed from all these wrong policy. At the end, of course, the end of all this policy was the Doha Agreement. As in the morning, Ambassador Khalilzad mentioned that government of Afghanistan was not a part of that. That's true. We didn't, as a member of negotiation team, we didn't go with this. We didn't go with the base of that agreement because we were not a part of that. Taliban were feeling that they were defeated U.S. and NATO. So they didn't care about us. Even they were not respecting the time and managing the time for the negotiation. So all of these, they were, the lessons that we learned from past 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarabi. I appreciate that. Ambassador Samad, please.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for this wonderful event. There is a lot of richness here. I also want to thank everyone, American, Afghans, and others here who have cared for Afghanistan in the past, civil, military, and others, and who continue to care. And I think it's important to continue to focus on Afghanistan as America enters a new political reality. So the title of this, interestingly enough, as we discussed with Dr. Farhadi, is Rethinking. And I think that rethinking requires a lot of thinking, actually, both about the past, about now, and now with these transitions taking place, about the future. And I think that, I hope that out of these discussions and focus on Afghanistan, we can have an impact on policy formulations and on the thinking moving forward. This particular question that you posed, John, is about policy and what we learned over the last 20 years. I, as an Afghan, want to expand this a bit, because as an Afghan, as has been mentioned by several people, we have obviously primary responsibility for our country. And I think that every Afghan needs to understand that our country is our primary responsibility. Therefore, we need to look back. We need to look very deep into our history, into our society, into our culture, into our politics, into our leadership in the past, leadership now, and learn and draw some of the very important lessons that can help us, and then maybe help others who care about Afghanistan and who have shared interests. But the 20 years really don't do us justice, because the 20 years are intrinsically linked with the previous 23 years, in my opinion. And for some people, the previous 23 years of Afghanistan, going back to 1978 with the first communist coup, a Soviet invasion, the end of the Soviet invasion after a decade, the emergence of the Mujahideen, the intra-Mujahideen strife and conflict, the rise of the Taliban 1.0, the fall of the Taliban, 9/11, of course the US and NATO intervention into Afghanistan, and the rest is history, of course, are all very linked. If we had paid enough attention, if we had done what was supposed to be done prior to 9/11, for example, maybe we wouldn't have had a 9/11. Perhaps that could have been avoided in one way or the other. So for us Afghans, we really need to look very deep. We need to have very thoughtful conversations amongst ourselves, regardless of our political persuasions and our emotional state nowadays. But when I was writing this chapter for that book, I came across something very simple, but something very telling for us. Just going back about 100 or 110 years into Afghan history, to the time of just pre-independence, the end of British colonial presence in Afghanistan and all of that. Since that time, which is maybe 100 years or so, we have had 14 regime changes in this country, in my country. We have had 16 leaders who have come and gone, 8 of whom were violently killed. And our national flag has been redesigned 17 times. And on top of that, this is the only country, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that in modern times has been a battlefield for all 3 superpowers of the day: Great Britain, the Soviet Union, US, NATO. There is no precedence in modern history. This is a very unique case. This is something that should really make us Afghans, owners of that country, think very hard about why. What is happening? Yes, geography absolutely plays an important role, has always played an important role. The geopolitical, geostrategic, nowadays geoeconomic implications cannot be denied. But there's more. Besides geography, there are many other countries that have problems with geography, but they haven't undergone this kind of adventure or experience, if you would. So I think that for us Afghans, we need to look at how we connect, how we understand our country and our people. You know, you have talked a lot today about whether the US and others, including the Russians, the Chinese tomorrow maybe, and others, understand Afghanistan, whether they made mistakes, what kind of strategic understanding they had, or the coherence or lack of coherence that existed in regards to Afghanistan. Yes, but then what about us, Afghans? We need to also understand, I think that we have a problem and had a problem, and this is one of the reasons I resigned twice from government jobs, from ambassadorial positions, because I realized that we're really not doing what we're supposed to do. We are not really heading in the right direction. We're not avoiding the pitfalls that are laying ahead, and we're not taking advantage of the opportunities, the amazing opportunities that Afghanistan had over a 20-year period. We talked a lot about opportunities that were wasted today. And so you can imagine how an Afghan feels about the loss of opportunities. So I think that overall, we need to also do some soul searching. And we need to do that in a way that, to understand that some of the leadership, some of our leaders probably did not really connect very well to their country and their population. Did not really fully understand the divides that exist, the cleavages as somebody mentioned earlier. Whether they are cultural, ethnic, linguistic, religious, at times clannish, at times exported from the outside, imposed on us, at times as a result of our own misdeeds and misunderstandings. So this really is something that I hope, after all these years, we can learn from, we can take stock of, we can start an intra-Afghan engagement that does not immediately try to bring up the issue of how we carve the cake, how we divide power. Because immediately Afghans who want to start talking to each other think that, well, we're going to share power. But it's not about sharing power, it's about really reconnecting with each other. It's really about understanding each other. It's about learning the lessons, and it's about creating narratives, shared narratives. It's about rebuilding trust. There is no trust amongst Afghans, the same way that there's no trust outside of Afghanistan amongst other countries and political groups and others. But in the case of Afghanistan, it's pretty dire because we underwent 45 years of continuous mayhem and bloodshed. So for us, we are at a point right now where our weakest point in some ways. Look at what is happening to our women and girls. Look at the restrictions imposed on them. We talked a lot about the ideological part of this. Yes, there's an ideological part, but there's also a social, there's also a political, and there's a historical. So combining all of this are the lessons that we Afghans have to learn. And yes, maybe hopefully then we can share it with you. But you know, we have started as part of these platforms that I am engaged with, we've started talking about things such as what is national value, for example, to us? What does national interest mean for an Afghan? And what does it actually, how can you define that? What is national identity in a country with so many ethnic groups? Nowadays, there are people talking about the breakup of Afghanistan. How does that happen? Who plays a role? Who benefits? Who loses? Who gains? And is that the solution? Yes, the Taliban are a huge challenge to understand, first of all. You know, they're about 30 years old. The Taliban are about 30 years old. I remember the first time I heard the name. To this day, we're still scratching our heads as to what are they all about? What do they represent? What do they want? Where do they come from? Why are they doing what they're doing? So, for answering those questions, we actually have to engage with the Taliban. Yes, I do remember clearly, I was part of the Afghan delegations that came to Washington and others who came to Kabul to talk about peace negotiations, the letters that you mentioned that were received by the Taliban who wanted to capitulate, who wanted to a ceasefire, they wanted to go back to their homes. The decisions were not just Afghan decisions to say no. The decision, the opportunity that was squandered to say no and to say we are not ready to talk to you, we're not ready to accept you, was not just an Afghan decision. Yes, there were elements within Afghanistan, but it was also a decision that was taken during that time outside of Afghanistan, especially in Washington. So there are so many lessons, and at some point the Afghans have to learn theirs, and others hopefully, and then we can share them. But it's a process, and it's a process that has to start. And I'm glad that you have started a process, and I hope this process leads to lessons learned, and I hope that then we can apply those. Hopefully, for policymakers today, we're again probably going to look at Afghanistan, even though it may not be a priority issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Samad. Barney, over to you, please.
Well, I'd also like to thank the organizers and all of you for the invitation. I just hope that after I make my intervention, you will not feel that I have abused your hospitality. The ancient Chinese strategic thinker said that the keys to victory were know your enemy and know yourself. We have talked a lot about how we failed to know the enemy. I want to talk about how we failed to know ourselves. Because I believe that the United States is not capable of learning lessons or applying the relevant lessons from Afghanistan. Let me start. We heard about the need to apply international human rights standards to the Taliban, maybe take them to the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice. Right now, the United States is threatening to defund and delegitimate both of those institutions because of their positions on Israel and Palestine. We heard praise for Richard Bennett, the special rapporteur on human rights in Afghanistan, while the United States is defaming and trying to undermine Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian territories. I have just returned to a trip to China, Qatar, and Pakistan. I can tell you the United States has no credibility, none, on those issues. So anything, I don't know what country we're talking about doing some of these things. Second, why didn't we succeed in Afghanistan? Because it was never our goal to succeed in Afghanistan. Listen to what President Bush said. The goal was to fight a war on terror. As General McKinley and Zalmay Khalilzad said correctly, in late 2001, 2002, and I have documented this in something that's about to be published, virtually every single Taliban leader, except Mullah Omar himself, tried to surrender. And instead, if we had asked ourselves, how do we stabilize Afghanistan, maybe we would have allowed them to participate in the bond process. But that we didn't ask that question. We asked the question, how to win the war on terror? And the answer was, by treating those who harbor terrorists the same as the terrorists themselves. And we never gave a moment's thought to what effect that would have on the future of Afghanistan. Third, we talked about tribalism. Let me tell you what tribalism is. Tribalism is an adaptation by a population to an environment that does not produce a sufficient economic surplus to support a hierarchical bureaucratic state. Afghanistan, especially post-Durand Line Afghanistan, was such a place. That's why the armed forces in Afghanistan always had to be foreign funded. So instead of using hierarchical bureaucratic institutions, people created very sophisticated methods of relying on kinship and reciprocity. How did we interpret those? We interpreted those as Afghans lacking capacity. And we tried to train Afghans to have capacity. That is, to have the capacity to implement our institutions, which were completely irrelevant to Afghanistan. It could never be sustained there. So we poured money into these institutions. We spent, I don't know how many times the Afghan GDP on setting up these so-called institutions. And I will tell you, training people and funding them does not create institutions. Institutions develop out of human relationships, and we were absolutely as blind to those human relationships as we are more, as President Biden was blind to the welfare of Afghans when he said that the United States bore no responsibility for them, and as he has been blind to the humanity of Palestinians in supporting what I believe is an Israeli genocide against Palestinians for the past few months. Finally, in 2000, I'm just picking a few random things. In 2009, I was on my way to Australia talk to the Australians about something. I stopped in Dubai where I met Qayyum Karzai, the late Qayyum Karzai, the brother of President Karzai, and Mansour bin Salah Khonizan, who was the special envoy. He had no title because he was not exactly official, but the special envoy working for King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia against Al-Qaeda and trying to bring the Taliban into a process. Qayyum had just come back from Kandahar, where he had met with several leaders of the Taliban. This is Afghanistan, where the brother of the president meets secretly with leaders of the armed opposition. And he told me that one of them, who was the former Minister of Counter-Narcotics, said, "Tell the Americans that if they want to deal with the Taliban, they have to treat them with dignity and respect." Well, a month later, I was in the US government working for Richard Holbrooke, the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I conveyed that message to him. And he said, "Dignity and respect? We don't even treat our allies that way." Now, today, the diplomatic action about Afghanistan does not involve the United States. It involves China, Russia, Iran, and Pakistan in a number of regional processes. We have all been talking about the future of diplomacy as a bilateral relationship between the United States and Afghanistan when we cannot even have access to Afghanistan without cooperation with one of those countries. So our national security apparatus does not have the capacity to think about a world in which we are not the sole superpower. I see no evidence of that. Nobody here has talked about how to deal with or cooperate with China, Iran, Pakistan, and Russia. Our whole foreign policy is not dedicated to that. Great power competition. Of course, competition and cooperation can be combined. But I could go on for quite some time. I've seen this with my own eyes as working for the UN and for the United States. So I'll just conclude with what I started with. The United States is not capable of learning lessons from Afghanistan or applying whatever lessons some individuals learn.
Thank you, Barney. I told you would not be disappointed with this particular panel. It just builds. It builds and builds and builds. To Andrew.
And then you get a denouement.
Please.
So it's never fair to go after Barney. Yeah. But anyway, back to lessons learned or not learned. I actually kind of agree with Barney that we're not terribly good at it. But again, I also wanted to start off just by thanking the conference organizers for the invitation to be on the panel, to John to moderating. I think Adib in his opening remarks this morning talked about the original, Afghanistan conference. I think it was January 2020. Three of us here were actually on that panel as well. I think Marvin, Barney, and I were sitting up here at that time as well. Unlike Adib, I have no memory of actually what I said on that panel, but I am very confident that whatever I said did not anticipate today's situation in Afghanistan. So I think for me, the starting point in terms of lessons from Afghanistan, if you've worked on it, is the need for humility because we've gotten it wrong so many times. So again, my remarks today are given with a strong dose of humility, but like lessons, I mean, I think it's lessons learned or not learned. I think it's probably too early to know whether there will be lessons. Shamaila also talked about, that's good bureaucratic jargon these days. Eyes tend to glaze over when you talk about it. At USIP, we had a conference a few years ago and deliberately made the decision to call it lessons observed because we were also skeptical that lessons are learned. But I agree, there usually aren't learned. Our bureaucracy is not good at learning them. I mean, Colin's very familiar with Bob Comer's work on the Vietnam War, and you read that, and you just do a search and replace for Vietnam with Afghanistan, and again, it's very clear we weren't good at learning lessons from that. But I did want to situate my remarks today, though, within the context of just maybe the price we do pay from not learning our lessons, and Barney's just alluded to some of them. But it's Veterans Day on Monday, and so I think it's a good time to remember the more than 2,300 American servicemen and women who lost their lives in Afghanistan, about half that number of our NATO allies as well. Ambassador McKinley also noted the civilians, whether they're diplomats or contractors or development workers who lost their lives. But again, all those numbers pale in comparison to the estimated 150 to 200,000 Afghans. And just the fact that we have no accurate numbers is a statement in its own right. We have fairly good numbers about our own casualties, but not the Afghan civilians who died over the 20-year period, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, but also the Afghan Taliban. And so we pay a really heavy price for not learning lessons. And for my remarks today also, we're short on time, so I think I'll just mention the issue of that we're not good at the whole issue of preventing war and resolving conflict as an alternative to fighting wars, or resolving conflicts that could end wars earlier than they would ordinarily have end. And lots of work in the last 3 years has been done, sort of analysis on why we lost the war in Afghanistan. A lot less work has been done on why we lost the peace in Afghanistan. Fortunately, my former USIP colleague, Kate Bateman, is about to, and now War Commission colleague, has worked on an edited volume that USIP will be publishing soon on the whole issue of some of the reasons for the failure to achieve a political settlement in Afghanistan. And there are many reasons. I thought today I just noted that from my own perspective, one of the main reasons for losing the war is because we viewed the conflict primarily as a security problem requiring military solutions rather than a political problem requiring a political solution. That's certainly not to say that there wasn't a need for the military presence, but I think there's a need for our military presence to be used more strategically as a political tool to achieve political objectives and not just to be used to try to win a war, which after a few years in, it was quite clear was unwinnable. In my view, the root causes of the conflict in Afghanistan have nearly always been political, and yet the U.S. viewed it again as a security situation requiring a military solution. And again, I think that was understandable in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, terrorist attack, and the need to really focus on that CT effort, which again was, very successful in a very short period of time. But then we continued to fight that war on terror for 2 more decades. I think during those 2 decades, our military objectives of winning the war consistently trumped the political objectives of trying to win the peace. And I think that's where I'm hoping, through some of the work of the Commission, but also the work of others, we can try to understand that dynamic better, of how to, again, invest more early on in the process of recognizing the need to engage, to negotiate, to talk to our enemies and adversaries, hopefully to prevent conflict, but also to end the conflict through negotiations and peace processes. And political settlements, often it's messy, compromises need to be made. But as Shamila mentioned, I think it is a problem that the U.S. military doesn't really have a war termination doctrine, as Chris Kalenda has written a lot about. And so we just carry on fighting because we don't know how to end our wars. And that's where I think if we could use our military force more effectively to achieve political objectives of supporting some of the diplomatic efforts and leading to a peace settlement or some political settlement, we need to do a better job of that. So I'll end with that because I know we're very short on time.
You can either decide to cut everybody off at real short increments, or you can allow the richness of your expertise to flow. I chose to do the latter. I hope the audience will appreciate that. We are at about 5 minutes remaining, though, and so what I would like to do to sort of close out the panel, if I could, is do one speed round down. By that I mean 2 minutes or less for each of you. And I would like to focus on this. So many of the conversations that I've had, for obvious reasons, on Afghanistan over the last 3 years end in very dark and sad places. I would like to end this particular panel on a note of hope, if we could. And so what I'd like to do is to ask each of you to provide sort of one thing that is hopeful about the future in Afghanistan as you see it. What is an item that we could grab onto as a piece of hope for the country, for the people, for our relationship with Afghanistan? And I'll start with you, Marvin, please.
You with me?
Down at the end.
No, Marvin.
I think what hope we have lies within the Afghan people themselves and the kind of resilience that they have shown despite decades of conflict. The great loss here, and this was alluded to earlier, that one of the accomplishments that we made during those 20 years, and I think maybe the only one, is we had an opportunity to create human capital beyond anything Afghanistan has ever seen before. And tragically, because of these events, we've lost that and probably cannot recover it anytime soon. So Afghanistan is starting off with a deficit situation. But I still have faith here that if we have patience here, that somehow that and strategies that are well thought through, that there still is an opportunity here for Afghanistan to come out of this, maybe not necessarily in the way that we wanted to see, but in its own way. Let me stop on that.
Thank you, Marvin. I appreciate that. And I share your, I've always been amazed at the resilience of the Afghan people. I share your sentiment on that. Dr. Shrabi?
The hope is Afghan women. Afghan women, that they are resilient, they are committed, and day to day they are facing with all the torture and oppression and everything, but they're still resisting. Not only Afghan women inside the country, but Afghan women in diaspora, for their lobbying, for their advocacy, that they are knocking every door. This is the hope for the future of Afghanistan. And also for Afghan women, there is a little bit sign of the hope of this bringing Taliban to the Court of Justice. So the four countries stand with Afghan women and other 21 countries supporting that. And I hope that the United States also support that and to bring Taliban to the ICJ. So this is a small hope. And the third one is this UN-led process, Doha process, that the roadmap developed by the Ambassador Senator Oglo. This is something that there should be more coordination and should be much more, get much more support by the US and the regional country that to fulfill that roadmap. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Sarabi. If there's one thing I've learned from my own wife, it's never count out a strong woman. And as you've demonstrated, Afghanistan certainly has its share of those. Thank you. Ambassador Samad.
Thank you. Again, as we stand at a crossroad waiting to see what kind of new formulations come out of Washington, at least, the next administration, I think it's very important to realize that there are some lessons, hopefully good lessons that have been learned from this, and that it can be used in this process, and that we can appreciate limitations that we have in terms of state building, nation building, and all of that, when there's opportunities, how to use those. I am, of course, also very much an Afghan people-centric person, and I think that we have to put the Afghan people at the center of all types of decisions that have to be taken. But I told you that geography has been a curse, but I think that we can turn geography into an advantage for Afghanistan as well by looking at how to balance things. So Afghanistan needs a balancing act, both at home, and that's something that a lesson that hopefully the Taliban will learn one way or the other, and also internationally. Whenever history has shown Afghanistan has been able to maintain balance at home and abroad, it has been safe, stable, and prosperous.
Oh, thank you for that. I share that hope. Barney, please.
Well, first is something that I'm sure we're all ambivalent about, which is that for the first time in decades, Afghanistan is now controlled by a single political organization, which exercises control throughout the country. It is an oppressive rule, but as someone noted, even more oppressive was the kind of pervasive, non-centered violence that existed before the Taliban. Now, that means there's an address for Afghanistan. The neighbors of Afghanistan, whom we usually demonize in this context, have actually learned some lessons. They now have reached a consensus on 2 points. One is that no one will support armed opposition to the current government, not because they like it, but because they know that the result will not be a better alternative, but chaos. And second, that none of them will unilaterally recognize the Islamic Emirate of the Taliban, because that would set off a competition among states in the region. So they've decided, whether they'll keep to it, I don't know, that they have to decide these things collectively. The United States should value those achievements by people we often consider to be enemies and see if it can build on them.
Oh, thank you, Barney. I appreciate that. My hope, in line with yours, is that we don't view Afghanistan as a platform or a region of competition between us and those states, and rather as one of cooperation, because we don't need to compete everywhere all the time. Sometimes it helps to cooperate, even with your adversaries, when it suits your interests. Andrew?
Unfortunately, I think the Taliban are making the same mistake we made in 2001 or 2. And I think one of the lessons of Afghanistan, certainly over the last 40 years, is it's really hard for a very small group to maintain centralized control indefinitely. So I don't think the situation is going to stay like this indefinitely. I don't think it's necessarily going to change quickly. But I do think it will 10 years from now. I think that you were going to ask a question about 10 years from now. I think the situation will be different. I don't think it will largely be different because of anything the U.S. does. But I think more internally by Afghan people or potentially, as Barney noted, neighbors. And things being different, as Barney also noted, can mean things can go in a worse direction of civil war, and I think that's to be avoided. But I'm cautiously optimistic because as much as we focus on all the mistakes of the last 20 years, there were, as one speaker did note, there were some tremendous successes. And having worked in Afghanistan in the very dark days of the 1990s when the first Taliban 1.0, it was very hard to see light at the end of the tunnel. But I think because Afghanistan has been transformed in so many ways, primarily through education, I believe, but also media, social media, connectedness, it's not as isolated as it was. I don't think the status quo that we see today can last forever. So I'm cautiously hopeful that the change will be in a positive direction and not a negative one.
I appreciate that. That's a great way to end it. I hope you all join me in thanking this extraordinary panel. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you all for your time and for your interest as well.